No, otherwise I will introduce our first speaker of the day. And of course I have to make some publicity about one of his books. We always do this. You absolutely have to buy this not for Christmas because that's too late for next time. So I start by introducing the book by showing his book, Less for Liberty, Rebels and Radicals Transported to Australia. As I understand it, it might be turned into a documentary, which is also one of the many activities. Right? Yes, that's right. So Toby Moore has a connection to Monash University, of course. He's a senior lecturer in communications and media studies. He's been a program maker at ABC Television, and he has many close industry links with professionals working in media and policy studies, which has a lot to do with teaching. This is the best of both worlds for university and practitioner at the same time. So his brings a lot of knowledge about your area, and so for the rest you can read the impressive, description of many activities in the leaflet that we have. So let's start with the day. Welcome.
Thank you, Haskell. Is the microphone working? No, is it working? That's great. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I should also say I'm Director of the National Centre for Australian Studies at Monash University, based at the Caulfield campus, which is an interdisciplinary centre like the European Centre, and one of our major markets for the future and even presently has been people training to be school teachers. And our challenge, if you like, has been to make Australian history, politics, cultural studies, literature engaging for young people and mature age students, undergraduates and postgraduates. And really that has been the mission of my life as a documentary maker at the ABC and as a publisher and as a journalist over a varied career. How to engage people in Australian stories. And a kind of key change for our curriculum in the last couple of years to reflect our research has been to posit Australia, the experience of Australia in a global context. In fact, what we like to call a transnational context. And the book that I'm going to speak to you about now, Death or Liberty, Rebels and Radicals Transported to Australia, is an example of that research that looks at the Australian experience in the 18th and 19th century in a global context, which involves, in this case, the British Empire and Europe, and also North America. So we've moved away from a focus just on Australia as a fortress, if you like. And I find this engages students. I talk in schools, primary schools as well as secondary, and it certainly engages our undergraduates. And so we've reorientated our curriculum, whether it's environment, economics, diplomatic history, the history of war, to focus on that transnational experience, diaspora, immigration, and the circulation of ideas. Now, growing up in the suburbs of the Illawarra in Wollongong in New South Wales in the 1970s, as a teenager, I shared the prejudice of many children that the great events of history happened elsewhere. Oh, do we really have to do Australian history? I want to do Nazis. or the Russian Revolution, which happened to be my particular bias at that time. It seemed to be boring. Too much hill end and sovereign hill and gold pan. Too much of that horse and the cricketer. Now, I didn't know when I was 14, 15, that Australia had a robust, sometimes bloody history of descent, and that as colonies, we've been vitally connected to the revolutions sweeping the world. But the past is closer than we think. It's a gravestone. Researching my book, I learned that in an old cemetery in the Dapto, this is a university, Mike, so they seldom Well, I used to manage rock and roll bands. They have better ones. So, getting back to this gravestone. Researching my book, Death or Liberty, I learned that in a cemetery in the Dapto bush, where we skylarked as teenagers, in fact, I hot-wired a car that rolled, but that's another story. But where we skylarked as teenagers lay a French-Canadian revolutionary named Joseph Marceau, transported as a convict in 1839 along with 57 compatriots from French Canada for rebellion against the British Empire. That's his gravestone, which I located. Now, in Sydney's Verdant Botanical Gardens, where my wedding reception was held, I should add, in the mid-1990s, lies another humble grave belonging to the so-called Scottish martyr Joseph Gerald, exiled over the seas for the sedition of advocating universal suffrage, who had weakened during the voyage and died in 1796, aged 36. That's Joseph Gerald. A sensitive and highly educated man, Gerald's words to the court on learning of his 14 years banishment provides his epitaph.
God bless rock and roll.
Can you hear me anyway?
Yeah.
That's all right. Gerald's words to the court on learning of his 14-year banishment provides his epitaph. I quote, "The cause which I have embraced has taken deep root and must, I feel, ultimately triumph. I have my reward. I see through the cheering vista of future events the overthrow of tyranny and the permanent establishment of benevolence and peace." Now, the understated resting places of the Canadian rebel and the British radical disturb our conventional understanding of the convicts as criminals and begs the questions: how did they influence Australia's political culture? Why don't we learn the stories of such people at school and in our civic commemoration, when in fact they learn it in schools in Boston? They learn about Australian political martyrs. What can we, as Australian teachers, learn from their struggles and as Australian citizens? Now, while familiar with our convict antecedents, few Australians realise their homeland was once the British Empire's Guantanamo Bay, where 3,600 rebels, approximately, radicals and protesters, were transported as political prisoners in the late 18th and 19th centuries. This figure, 1 in 45 of all 162,000 convicts transported, was arrived at by eminent social historian George Roudet, who shifted through the court and convict records of individual prisoners for the entire period of transportation. The numbers break down to 2,250 from Ireland, 1,200 from England, Scotland and Wales, and 151 from North America. Only 120 were women. Broadly, they break down to the majority, ordinary people, farmers, peasants, workers who protest, riot, nationalist rebels in Ireland, in Canada, other parts of England, who are fighting for freedom from what they see as colonial yoke, and political prisoners who are more specifically overtly political, like Joseph Gerald, who are fighting for the reform of the British Constitution for a republic. Now, leading radicals who led the charge for democratic reform in Britain, Ireland and North America spent time here, vitally connecting the colonies to the revolutionary political changes sweeping Europe and the Americas. So a circulation of ideas and bodies. Death or Liberty was the rallying cry of a stream of Liberals, Democrats and Republicans. For example, English machine breakers, the Luddites, trade unionists, Chartists, who were wanting the democratic political reform that came to pass in Australia ahead of England, in fact. Radical journalists, many journalists were transported, which is something interesting. Preachers and intellectuals, and of course Irish, Canadian and American revolutionaries. Now, for the authorities alarmed by revolution in North America and then France, and alarmed at growing dissent at home, transportation to the Australian colonies served as both deterrent and a safety valve for the build-up of political pressure by excising ringleaders, organisers and propagandists of the dangerous radical movements and the rebellious, riotous or disloyal among the common people. If you take out the 5 troublemakers in a village who are organising an agricultural trade union, you've pretty well kiboshed reform in that area. Now this happened throughout the United Kingdom and Ireland. Now, while viewed by the British government at the time with the same alarm as today's terrorists, the political prisoners are now largely revered in their homeland as freedom fighters. Yet in Australia, with the exception of some leading Irish rebels, memory of these martyrs has dimmed. This is surprising, as many of the principles for which they were transported, freedom of speech, publishing and assembly, universal suffrage and responsible government, animate both the Liberal and Labor sides of politics. Now, the Republican idea was transmitted into Australia's DNA from the earliest years of settlement through the 2 very different men I want to talk about, lawyer Thomas Muir and Irish rebel Michael Dwyer. That's Thomas Muir. Muir was one of Joseph Gerald's fellow Scottish Jacobins. He was a dashing young orator and idealist in the Jeffersonian mould, whose crusade for electoral reform morphed into republicanism in the hopeful dawn of the French Revolution. In fact, he was in, there's a wonderful story which I'll tell you in the end about Muir, but he was actually escaped, what was he? He was a hunted man for distributing the works of Thomas Mann, The Rights of Man, Tom Paine, sorry, The Rights of Man, and he fled to Paris. He witnessed the execution of Louis XVI. In fact, claims he argued against it. Visited Ireland, then came back to Scotland to say goodbye to his girlfriend and mother, and got nabbed, and was transported to Australia. As a gentleman convict, as many of the political prisoners were, he was granted land and in fact, the Scottish martyrs, all 5 of them were the most educated people in the colony, and were treated with some respect, but also some fear. Now, Muir escaped Sydney on an American ship, went across the Pacific, got to Canada, but a British boat came into view, so he was smuggled onto a Spanish ship. And the Spanish, who were allies of the French, should have been sympathetic, but they were scared of this radical young man. And they intercepted his letters to George Washington, no less, asking Washington for asylum, and instead took him up to California and then Mexico, where he realised he was a prisoner of the Spanish, and ended up in everyone's favourite place of detention, Cuba. And didn't get to see George Washington. They decided he was a British spy and tried to deliver him back to Spain for trial. A British fleet came upon them off the coast of in the Channel, and he was unfortunately hit in the face with grape shot. The lucky point about that was he was not recognisable to the British when they boarded, and ended up in a hospital in Belgium, and was spirited away by no less than Lafayette, no less than Talleyrand, back to France, where he's made a citizen of France, and Napoleon appointed him head of the Scottish Directorate, that is government in exile of Scotland, and he died on Australia Day in, I think, 1796 from his wounds. So this man called himself a citizen of the world at his trial, and symbolises, if you like, this distribution of the zone that Australia, the Sydney colony was in, of a global, European connected world. Now, he ended his days, as I said, as Napoleon's advisor on British matters. Now, Dwyer was an Irish braveheart, a knockabout hero of that country's 1798 United Irishmen's Revolution, who waged a guerrilla war against the English after the defeat of that revolution, before being tricked into surrender. and is honoured with a monument at his gravesite at Waverley Cemetery. Now, Dwyer came from a humble background and enjoyed in Australia some success and something of an Irish trifecta. He became a policeman, a publican and a folk singer. And his grave is still a magnet to Irish backpackers who come to pay homage to this man. Now, Muir was the new media activist, a pamphleteer and publicist of information the government deemed seditious. He was part of a movement called corresponding societies that used the new invention of the postal service to distribute information the government wanted to suppress. I'll get up to it later, but does this remind you of someone that may be under detention or house arrest in an embassy at the moment in England? Dwyer was the man of action, a warrior and resistance leader. Two different sorts of bravery, one moral force of rational argument, the other physical force. A willingness to fight for change in the minds of men and on the battlefield. Both leaders had the strength of their convictions. Australians should learn about these exiled political convicts because their often inspiring stories link us to a changing world, overcoming that nothing ever happened in Australia prejudice, and they bring to life an Australian and world history too frequently taught as dry, abstract themes. My argument as a publisher, a documentary maker and a historian is don't forget the story, and it's one of individual agency. Yes, social class, organisation, economics, vitally important. It pervades my book, but actually people make history. People make things happen. Now, there is a 21st century resonance, as I alluded in the story of Muir. Many of the political prisoners sentenced to Australia were sacrificing their own liberty for the freedom to write and speak what they wished. But a state fashioned in more authoritarian times had difficulty coping with the revolution in communications that had greatly expanded the public sphere. A republic of letters, if you like, as they called it, in which intellectuals and other ideas entrepreneurs used the discourse of journalism and the convivial spaces of cafes and pubs to debate and promote new ways of seeing and doing. With technical improvements and growing literacy came a proliferation and diversification of publishing, newspapers, pamphlets, treatises, manifestos and proclamations. In these media innovations, new rights, new classes, new systems of government and new nations were first imagined. Now when I teach this stuff in media, I lecture in media communications, the young people get instantly, they see the connection to new media today, and people were excited about the new media back then. As media scholar John Hartley has argued, the creation of popular readerships in America and France by adversarial journalism stimulated the empowering idea of popular sovereignty. Reforms codified in black letter law and revolutions won or lost with sabre and bullets were born of the thoughts and ideals traded in this rambunctious free market of ideas, stretching from Britain to the colonies in Ireland, North America, India, South Africa, and even to the new prison provinces of Australia. In language echoing today's debates about the internet and WikiLeaks, Muir asked the jury whether the suppression of literature was even possible in an age, and I quote, when the works of Mr. Burke and Thomas Paine flew with rapidity to every corner of the land, hitherto unexampled in the history of political science. You may as well ban the alphabet, Muir said, as ban these books. Of course, the minute Muir was sentenced to 40 years, he wrote in his cell a pamphlet which within weeks was flying around the world through the legal presses. So these people are great propagandists. These liberal laws in England for sedition lasted well into the mid-19th century, and in Ireland and India into the 20th century, and ensured that many of the political prisoners transported to Australia were some of the finest wordsmiths and propagandists of their age, such as the 1848 Young Ireland leaders William Smith O'Brien, Tom Marr and John Mitchell. That's the Tolpuddle Martyrs, there were six altogether, 5 of them who started an agricultural union, and through the suppression of that union and the transportation of these 6 exemplary men, their leader was a very literate lay Methodist preacher. England actually made, the government made England and Scotland safe for trade unionism, and of course Australia. They overreached themselves. This is Linus Miller, a Canadian lawyer who was transported to Australia, wrote an amazing book. George Lovelace, the leader of the Top Huddle Martyrs, wrote an amazing memoir of his transportation. These are the young Ireland revolutionaries of 1848. More penmen and pikemen. Great propagandists, thank you. John Boyle O'Reilly, another Fenian journalist and soldier who was part of what they call the Fenian Mutiny against the British rule in the 1860s. They were the last group of political prisoners, of any prisoners, transported to Australia, to Western Australia. These are some of the pamphlets that are transported, and another shot of New York. Just to jump ahead, it is wrong to think that freedom, democracy and self-government were handed to the Australian colonies by an enlightened mother country without struggle. These rights had to be fought for by true believers making a stand throughout the empire, many of whom had to fight again as political prisoners in the Australian colonies to keep their causes alive before the world. Political convicts made a mark on their place of banishment, rising in violent rebellion at Castle Hill, that is the Irish, promoting economic development as business leaders, publishing radical journals as prisoners in Australia, such as the Irish Felon, which was a Young Ireland publication in the 1850s that agitated for liberal reforms and even Aboriginal rights in Australia, launching clever legal defences akin to the Mabo case against unjust treatment by authorities to rally the anti-transportation movement in this country, organising trade unions. A West Indian English convict became the trade union leader after being pardoned in Tasmania. And in the case of revolutionary Irish nobleman William Smith O'Brien, even drafting a democratic constitution for Tasmania to hasten responsible government. This is some of the young Islanders. That's William Smith O'Brien, who's actually, his brother was a lord, and he was related to Queen Victoria, who was the most royal person ever to visit Australia, and he was in solitary confinement. He became very much the Nelson Mandela of the British Empire at the time. And like the Top Huddle Martyrs, the campaigns to release these people actually did more for their causes than the revolutions they fought back in the country. So Australia is like a theatre in which these causes are played out and this mastered. So back in Britain, Ireland, North America, transported radicals such as the Top Huddle Martyrs, the Young Islanders and the Fenians became the focus of mass campaigns for their release. Not unlike what we're seeing with Julian Assange at the moment. Many radicals were talented writers and propagandists, and they used their trial and then their punishment as theatre. A virtual library of published convict memoirs and pamphlets ensured contemporaries learned of the struggles, ideals and sufferings of the exiles. While grudgingly pardoned by chasing governments, some returned home as heroes, some even winning seats at Westminster. French-Canadian Xavier Prieur, one-time revolutionary, imprisoned in the Sydney Harbour suburb known as Canada Bay with fellow Canadian revolutionaries, rose to become Canada's superintendent of prisons. Think of that, a prisoner becomes superintendent of prisons. Returning to Muir's spirited odyssey around the globe, a succession of daring-do rescues, climaxing in the dramatic Fenian escape from Fremantle jail on board the Catalpa, revived hopes for political comrades back home in the colonies, demonstrating just how connected Australia was to international liberation movements. The Americans are on the sidelines, mocking England. They are the radical republic transporting revolution, and again, they are rescuing prisoners from the Australian colonies, and also they themselves, not the government, but radical democratic zealots invade Canada and are transported to, they don't do a very good job of invading Canada, but are transported back to Australia, are transported to Van Diemen's Land. I think it's 92 Americans are transported, US citizens, eventually pardoned. Just by way of conclusion, and I can in the book, I trace how many of the movements political prisoners come from are represented at the Eureka Stockade, and how their ideas of the Chartists and the Scottish Martyrs seep into the constitutions of the 1850s and deliver democratic government to the Australian colonies ahead of Great Britain. But what I wanted to leave you on is this idea that Australians do struggle to remember this stuff, and perhaps it's because of a purely national focus has blinded us to the transnational character of the colonial experience. The political prisoners, like so many immigrants from Europe to Australia, traverse the globe, contributing to the different places in which they live, and even making virtue of their status as citizens of the world. So they travel as governors, soldiers, sailors, immigrants, explorers, scientists, missionaries, travellers, and of course convicts. But happily, the study of Australia's past at universities has benefited from a turn towards a new critical imperial history that reframes and refreshes colonial Australia as part of a global empire shaped by people on the move, demands for popular participation, and a new media age. Australian historian Anne Curthoy has observed that the globalisation characteristic of now has prompted historians of Australia to pay far more attention to all those processes, events and themes that are best understood beyond the nation and which cross national boundaries. Curthoy has welcomed a new trend among scholars where the Australian historical experience becomes part of the study of relationships, networks and connections traced back and forth and indeed around the empire and North America, South America as a whole. So far from being isolated outposts, the colonies erected on land seized from the Aboriginal people were important transnational hubs for commodity extraction, trade, immigration, land privatisation and development, information exchange and of course punishment. Thus the stories of Muir, O'Brien and Marceau reveal a contested empire in which dissent and revolution jostled with hope and glory. And it's important to understand that the land hunger that so many of these political prisoners are struggling against in Ireland and Britain, Wales, Scotland, Jubilee Closure Acts is satisfied through land grants in Australia at the expense of the Aboriginal people. So the enclosure, the privatisation of the common land in Britain as capitalism brings a new mode of private property, which is the underpinning of the whole rise in the convict population. That privatisation is even more severe in Australia, Canada, and it's wholesale theft really. But the irony is that people, you can read in the memoirs some of these political prisoners who are usually a bit more literate than the average crim, saying, "Mum, this is fantastic over here. You know, I'm eating better food," or "I'm pardoned now and I have a land grant." One always has to remember whose land that is. That England does not endure the same revolutions as France because of the use it makes of settler capitalism in the frontiers. And of course, they're trying to squish the French in Canada, who are Canadian or British subjects. They're trying to displace their mode of agriculture as well, which in part brought my friend to that, Joseph Marceau, on which I opened. So I'll finish there and happy to answer any questions or discussion or talk to you later. Thanks.
So, time for questions now. So we have about 5 minutes for questions.
Not a question, but a comment. I found your talk absolutely fantastic. When I arrived in Australia, I was trying to familiarize myself with Australian history. I only found quite boring Australian history. And it was terrible. There were no links to the rest of the world. I taught history in certain universities and other places, and I'm still doing it. But it's always a connection with the rest of the world, because we are not on an island on the southwest of the island. We are part of Europe, and in some ways, we were more integrated in the world in 1830 than we were in 1900.
it's a very valid point. I think the writing of history and the researching and study of it goes through phases, and there was a time when people learnt empire history, learnt Commonwealth history, and certainly Manning Clark's histories have the Europe and the Enlightenment and Christianity and all of these aspects of ideas present as part of the Australian story. And certainly Geoffrey Blaney does too. I think in a rebellion, a nationalist rebellion in the 70s against that, that has been now tempered and changed. So the same historians that were interested in Australia now being transnational, but the TV producers and executive producers and the newspaper editors, they studied in that nationalist period, and they tend to, if I take a story to the ABC, they always seem to want a kind of Bush Tucker man, Anzac approach without understanding Anzac is inherently global, which is how we are researching it at Monash. In fact, universities are doing it in a really interesting way now, and the broader public conversation hasn't quite caught up. And it needs to, if Australia is taught in this way, which it must, because that's how the national curriculum says it should be taught, then I think things will get more interesting. And it has to happen. Young people are travelling the world, you know, polluting the world with air flight. So it's the new transportation, isn't it?
What kind of legacy do you think these people have had? So if we wanted to clarify to students that, you know, these revolutionaries were here in Australia, what kind of legacy could we see today in them being here?
It is quite clear that responsible government would not have been granted to New South Wales, Victoria, Van Diemen's Land, Queensland, if it was not for the Canadian Revolution. And those people bled in Canada, and they bled in Australia. Their governor, Arthur, Port Arthur fame, was the governor in Canada and sent them here. So the zone, there is no Australia, the zone was imperial. Within the imperial place, people rebelled, published, promoted ideas, but funnily enough, Australia colonies were where a lot of the reforms happened first. So yes, Canada, after its failed dismally revolution, gets gradually responsible government. In New South Wales, Henry Parkes writes to the Foreign Office in England and others and says, we're going to have a revolution here if you don't just give it to us. So the agitation in Victoria about those 1850s constitutions, which are amazing documents, those colonial, forget the federal one. They owe so much to Muir and the Scottish Martyrs, to the Chartists, to the Canadians, different aspects of them. The secret ballot that evolves, and very short parliaments, universal male suffrage, which is granted with amendment to those. These are all what these guys and women have been arguing for a long time. And I don't think you ever, it's like Godfather Part 3's old slogan, power is not just given. You have to fight for it in the streets. And that's what these people did. And we seem to have this view that Queen Victoria woke up one day and they just gave us this. No, every bit of it is fought. We see what it's like over climate change. Every bit is fought. And these people did the hard yards of surrendering their own liberty.
And then there are Icon Wiley, the German Revolution in 1848, who were all, many of them were drawn to the goldfields.
They were.
And they had a big impact in Victoria especially, and the interplay between the Scottish slave at the land and the Germans is still visible.
And they had a lot to do with, well, there were Italians, there was the Young Ireland movement. You know, one of the Young Ireland leaders that they couldn't transport was tried 5 or 6 times, Duffy. And in the end, they can't sentence him, but he immigrates anyway and becomes Premier of Victoria and is involved in the Selection Acts. So it is very direct. So what I do in the book is trace the very direct links to constitutional, political, trade union and cultural agitation. So the journal of the Young Islanders, The Nation, which has the amazing line, we want to be racy of the soil and have cultural nationalism. The invention of the nation, of the people within colonialism, is picked up by the Bulletin, which is really, really significant. So these things are happening in America, Canada, Germany, this new nationalism that's back, which has its ugly turn in the White Australia policy, let me say. But at the same time, it's got a generous 19th century, more cosmopolitan flavour.
And there was David James, who comes from Berwick, very anti-English, who started the Age, which was a radical newspaper. And this all built into this Victorian pool. New South Wales pool is different.
Yeah, it is.
South Australian pool is a window.
Well, Victorian liberalism is different too. New South Wales always been a laissez-faire capitalism, like new liberalism too. Yes.
One more question.
I think the way that you've presented is really, really exciting, because I think the contrast that you're making with, you know, the nationalist way that the history was taught a few years ago, because I've taught at incredibly culturally diverse schools, and when you're trying to engage, you know, Sudanese refugees, Afghani kids, Islander kids, a lot of this rhetoric that they hear in the media kind of disempowers them to engage with Australian politics, because they're meant to feel grateful for being here and not critical of some of the messages that they're receiving at the hands of the Australian media. So to have a transnational approach where rebellion is what has formed Australian identity is a really important thing to teach these kids. I think one of my friends was saying that something came out in the paper recently that I think it's something like an incredible 48% of Victorians or Melburnians are either born overseas or have a parent who is. So I think we need to be cognizant of that when we teach Australian history, so that the kids that we're teaching are not necessarily what's being represented in the media, which is controlled by a different generation of people. So I think it's really, really powerful.
It's a really key point. There's a wonderful book, Ghassan Haj's White Nation, and his follow-up against paranoid nationalism. I published those two books, and that whole Australia was much more overt in its cosmopolitanism in some ways. Also, British race patriotism took over, but it was in conflict in the 19th century. And the Irish, as the Islamic group at the time, if you like, is a really significant trend. But there's also a kind of practical multiculturalism in the early days too, because people have to get on that we're at each other's throats. Britain, the United Kingdom, and the word Britain, as John Hurst has said, made more sense in Australia, because you had an Irishman and a Scotsman, it sounds like a joke, and a Welshman, all in the same street. You know, people, Britain as a notion, they were still saying England a lot, in England, but Britain was used here as a way of having this multi-ethnic polity, where language, you know, the Irish spoke Irish often. So we have a tradition of that I think, and people like the Young Islanders wrote about India, wrote about Africa and their colonial struggles, or decolonisation struggles in the 19th century. So there's a way of having a much more inclusive history of Australia, and they exist. They're out there. The egalitarianism of white Australia, the white Australia was posited as an egalitarian thing. All white people could have equal rights. You know what I mean? But someone lost out. Ghassan Haj's book was very good on that. I praise some of his ideas in their validity.
What's the name of the book, sorry?
Ghassan Haj's White Nation. Fantasies of white supremacy, or fantasies of multicultural, fantasies of white supremacy in a multicultural society. It's slightly off topic, but would be relevant for the next part. His argument is that liberal, nice multiculturalism always leaves Anglo-Celts still in charge as the people that stand for the nation. And so it's a side dish of tabbouleh on a steak and chips plate, as opposed to what it really is, which Christos Zolkis knows it is, which we all know it is, who teach and live and catch public transport. It's a big spaghetti plate of different things, and the hybridisation and conflicts and negotiations are the big story of Australia. Americans get it, and Brits better than we do. But the media kind of hung up in the past, I would argue. There's new media that's not like that. I better stop there.
Thank you so much.